He found her on a Tuesday. Brandon Reeves didn't knock. He never knocked. He stood in the middle of Harper's old apartment, the one she'd scrubbed clean, the one she'd packed in 40 minutes flat at 2 in the morning, and he held up her spare key between two fingers like a trophy, like proof. His suit was pressed. His jaw was tight. And his eyes moved through the empty room the way a man's eyes move when he realizes the thing he owned has gone missing. "She thinks she can just disappear," he said to the man standing behind him. "She has no idea who she's dealing with." He wasn't wrong about one thing. Harper had disappeared. He was dead wrong about the rest. If you were running from someone who had your name, your history, your face memorized, and the money to find you anywhere, what would you do? Where would you go? And what would you do the night you realized running wasn't enough? Stay with us until the end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. If it moves you, hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe now. You will not want to miss what comes next. HarperCollins had a system. She had learned, the hard way, that systems were the only thing standing between a woman and the particular kind of man who believed love gave him the right to own her. Her system was this: no habits, no routines anyone could track. She varied her route to work every single day, sometimes Boylston, sometimes cutting through the back of Copley Square, once taking 3 different trains just to feel the paranoia drain out of her shoulders before she stepped onto the hospital floor. She paid cash for groceries at 3 different stores, rotating weekly. She had no social media, no gym membership. Her phone was a burner, replaced every 60 days. She had a go-bag packed and shoved behind the water heater in apartment 4C at the Whitmore, a luxury building on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston that she absolutely could not afford, which was exactly why she'd chosen it. Brandon Reeves was a man who understood desperation. He had never once understood the tactical mind of someone who had decided to stop being desperate and start being invisible. The apartment was smaller than what the building's lobby suggested. 11th floor, northeast corner, with windows that looked out over the Charles River if you craned your neck at the right angle. The walls were white. She'd put nothing on them. Her furniture was second-hand. A couch from a Craigslist seller in Cambridge. A kitchen table she'd hauled up the elevator herself because she'd tipped the moving company that had delivered the bed and then never called them again. She owned 4 plates, 2 mugs, a single good knife she kept on the counter because she told herself it was for cooking. She was 31 years old. A face that had been handsome once and was now something harder than that, restructured by whatever had put the scar along his left jawline. She'd cataloged the scar the way she cataloged everything, clinically, automatically. It was old. Surgical repaired, or close to it. Whatever had caused it had been significant. He wore good clothes the way some men wore armor. Every time she saw him, the shirt was pressed, the jacket was right, but his eyes didn't match the jacket. His eyes were the color of dark water, and they moved too carefully, the way eyes moved on someone who was always counting exits. She recognized that. She taught herself to do it. She did not introduce herself. He did not introduce himself. They had by tacit and mutual agreement decided to be strangers, and for 14 months that had worked just fine. His name, according to the mailboxes in the lobby, was D. Moretti. She had not looked further than that. She did not look further into things. That was also part of the system. Icham. The shift that broke everything started like every other shift. She got to Mass General at 6:45, 20 minutes before her 7 o'clock start, because she was always early. Not because she was eager, because the locker room was empty that early, and she could change and orient herself without anyone watching. She'd worked trauma for 6 years, first in Seattle under her real name, then for 8 months in Phoenix under the first alias, and now here. She was good at her job. Better than good, if she was being honest. Though she had learned to hold that kind of thought lightly because confidence made you visible. And visible was the one thing she could not afford. The night brought in a 17-year-old who'd come off a motorcycle without a helmet. A middle-aged woman with a dissecting aortic aneurysm who coded twice before they stabilized her, and a quiet stretch around 2 in the morning where Harper stood in the break room with bad coffee and felt the particular exhaustion that lived not in her muscles but somewhere behind her sternum. Her colleague, a nurse named Priya, who had been trying to befriend her for 6 months with the patience of a saint, came in and poured her own coffee and didn't say anything for a moment. "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days," Priya said. too, Harper said. It's fine. You need to eat something that isn't. Priya gestured at the vending machine selection Harper had already surveyed and rejected, whatever that is. I'm fine, Priya. Priya made a face that said she did not believe this, but had also learned when to let it go. That was actually the thing Harper respected most about her. The woman understood the architecture of a closed door. The rest of the shift was the shift. By 6 in the morning, Harper was in the locker room with her bag over her shoulder and the particular dull, scoured-out feeling that came after a night in trauma. Not bad, exactly. Just emptied. She rode the T home and watched a man sleep across the aisle from her and thought about nothing, which was a skill she had worked very hard to develop. She was 2 blocks from the Whitmore when she saw the black SUV. It was parked on the east side of Commonwealth, engine running, which meant either someone was waiting for a passenger or someone was watching. Harper didn't slow her pace. She didn't speed it up either. She looked at the vehicle the way she looked at everything, sidelong, peripheral, letting her brain do the work without tipping her body into a reaction. The windows were tinted. She couldn't see inside. The plates were a Massachusetts private registration, which told her nothing specific. She went through the Whitmore's lobby, nodded at the overnight concierge, took the elevator. The SUV was probably nothing. She told herself that all the way to her floor. She was still telling herself that when the elevator doors opened on 4 and she smelled it. Blood has a smell. People who haven't worked in medicine sometimes don't know that, or they think it's subtle. It isn't. It's iron and copper and something underneath that, something almost animal, and when there's enough of it, the smell reaches you before the sight does. Harper had smelled it in trauma bays so many times, her brain filed it automatically into the category of workplace before it ever got to fear. This was not a trauma bay. This was the carpeted hallway of the 4th floor of a luxury apartment building at 6:20 in the morning, and the smell was coming from the left. And when she turned, there was a trail on the carpet. Not a drop, not a smear, but a trail, which meant movement, which meant someone had been moving while they were bleeding, leading from the elevator alcove to the door of 4D. Harper Collins stood in that hallway for what was probably 4 seconds, but felt like 30. And in those seconds, she ran through every rational response available to her. Call 911. Yes. Obviously. That was the right answer. That was what a normal, private, uninvolved person did when they found blood in a hallway. Call 911, go into her apartment, lock the door, pack the go bag, be out of the building in under 10 minutes in case whatever had happened was connected to whoever might be coming, because blood trails didn't happen in a vacuum, and if someone had tracked trouble to this floor, then she had possibly already been seen, and she was already moving toward 4D before that calculation finished running. She didn't knock either. The door wasn't fully latched. She pushed it with 2 fingers, and it swung inward, and she saw him. Dominic Moretti was on the floor of his own living room with his back against the couch and his left hand pressed to his side, and his right hand holding a gun that came up the instant the door opened and pointed directly at her face. "Don't," he said. His voice was steady. She'd give him that. He was the color of old concrete, and his shirt was soaked through, and his eyes had the particular glaze that came with significant blood loss, but his voice was completely, terrifyingly steady. "I'm your neighbor," Harper said. "Apartment 4C. I know who you are." She didn't have a trauma kit. She had a nurse's habit of never being completely without resources, which meant her bag had gloves. She always carried 2 pairs. And a compression bandage she'd pocketed from a supply closet weeks ago during a paranoid spell and then forgotten about. She found kitchen towels. She found a first aid kit under his bathroom sink that was so well stocked it told her immediately that this was not the first time he'd needed one. She didn't ask about that. She worked the way she worked in the trauma unit, efficiently, quietly, hands doing what hands knew how to do while her mind processed. Entry wound on the left lateral abdomen. The blade hadn't gone horizontal, which meant the angle had been downward. Someone taller than him, or above him when it happened, or both. The wound was ugly, but not as deep as the bleeding volume suggested. Arteries were intact, or he'd already be gone. He'd hit a rich vascular area and bled hard, and his body had not appreciated it, but the damage was manageable. She repacked it tight, put her weight into the compression, and felt him flinch for the first time. "Sorry," she said automatically. "Don't apologize," he said. "It's a reflex. Break the reflex." She almost said that he could tell her how to talk when he wasn't the one bleeding on his own floor. She kept it inside. This needs stitches, she said. I can close it provisionally, but you need imaging. You might have a nick on something internal that we can't see here, and if you do, no hospital. I figured. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The gun was still in his hand. The glaze in his eyes had thinned a little. The pressure was helping, his body starting to stabilize. I can close it. I have nothing to close it with. He told her to look in the cabinet above the refrigerator. She did. What she found there made her stand for a moment with the cabinet open, looking at its contents. And then she closed it and went back without commenting, because commenting was not a door she wanted to open. She closed the wound. It took longer than it should have because she was working without proper lighting and with materials that were adequate but not ideal, and because he sat through the entire thing without making a sound, which was so profoundly unnatural that she kept checking his face to confirm he was still conscious. He was conscious. He was watching her. When she tied off the last closure and stripped the gloves and sat back against the base of his couch beside him, not planning to, her legs just stopped holding her up properly. He was still watching her. "You know my name," he said. "You know mine," she said. Silence. The apartment around them was, she noticed it now for the first time, extraordinarily spare. Not in the way of someone who traveled constantly and used the place as a depot. More like someone who had deliberately stripped away anything that could be used to understand them. "Your name is not the name on your lease," he said. Everything in her went still. She turned to look at him fully. His eyes met hers straight on. No calculation in them that she could see. No particular satisfaction at having dropped the information. Just a man who had said a factual thing and was watching her process it. "How long have you known?" she said. "Approximately 1 week after you moved in." 14 months. He had known for 14 months and said nothing, and she had been running her careful, paranoid, exhausting system this entire time, and the man through the wall had already found the seam in it. "And you didn't—" She stopped. "Didn't what? Go to Brandon?" He wouldn't know Brandon's name, didn't report it? To whom? Didn't leverage it? He'd had it for over a year and hadn't moved. "I didn't do anything," he said, "because it wasn't my business." He paused, the way people paused when they were choosing words with care. "It's my business now. Because I helped you. Because you came in here when I told you not to, with a gun in your face, and you helped me anyway." He looked down at his side, at her work. "That makes you my responsibility." HarperCollins had not been anyone's responsibility in 3 years. She didn't know what to do with the word. "I don't need a responsibility," she said. "That's not relevant." "That's absolutely—" "The man you're hiding from," he said. Quiet. Even. The way he said everything. "I know the type. I know how they operate. I know what they're willing to spend and how far they're willing to go and what they do when the money stops working." He met her eyes again. "He will find you eventually. Whatever system you're running, and it's a good one, it won't be enough forever." She wanted to argue with that. She had spent 14 months arguing with that, quietly, inside herself, every night when she pressed her palm to her locked door. She didn't argue with it now. "Who are you?" she said instead. He looked at her for a long moment. The gun was still in his hand, but it had stopped being a threat somewhere in the last half hour and had become just a thing he was holding. "Someone who is very difficult to threaten," he said. That was all he gave her. That night, that morning, whatever this strange, blood-soaked hour was, he gave her nothing else. She left his apartment at 8:15 with her ruined gloves in a bag and the smell of iron still in her throat. And she went into 4C and sat on her second-hand couch without taking her jacket off and stared at the wall between their apartments. She should pack the go bag. She should be out of Boston by noon. She didn't move for a very long time. On the other side of the wall, in an apartment that told you nothing about the man who lived in it, Dominic Moretti sat on his floor with his eyes closed and thought about the woman who had walked into a gun because she couldn't watch someone die. He thought about that for a while. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Harper slept for 3 hours. She knew it was 3 hours because she woke up at 11:14 and she'd sat down on the couch at 8:15, still in her jacket, still in her shoes, and she didn't remember closing her eyes. She remembered staring at the wall. She remembered the smell of blood that had followed her through the door. She remembered the sound of Dominic Moretti's voice, flat, unhurried, delivering the information that he'd known who she really was for over a year, the same way another man might tell you the weather. She sat up and her neck screamed at her for sleeping at that angle, and she pressed her fingers to the back of her skull and breathed. Her phone showed no messages. That was normal. Nobody messaged her. She had made sure of that. She should leave. She pulled her go bag out from behind the water heater and unzipped it and looked at what was inside. $1,400 in cash, a second phone still in the packaging, her backup ID, a change of clothes, a small medical kit that was better stocked than most civilian households. Everything she'd need to disappear again. It had taken her 4 months to build it. She'd been quietly proud of it in the way that people were proud of the infrastructure of their own survival. She zipped it back up and shoved it back behind the water heater. She didn't leave. She wasn't entirely sure why. She told herself it was because leaving in daylight was higher risk than leaving at night, which was partially true. She told herself it was because she hadn't slept properly, and making route decisions while sleep-deprived was how people made errors, which was also true. She did not tell herself the real thing, which was that the man through the wall had said the word responsibility, and something in her that had been clenched for 3 years had, very slightly, unclenched, and the sudden absence of that tension scared her almost as much as the tension itself had. At noon, she made coffee. At 12:30, she heard movement from 4D, careful movement, the kind of movement someone made when they were trying not to favor one side and not entirely succeeding. She heard it stop near what she calculated was his kitchen. She heard something set down on a hard surface, then silence again. She drank her coffee and looked at her wall and thought about a man who wouldn't go to a hospital. At 1 o'clock, she knocked on his door. She had a reason prepared. She was going to tell him she needed to check the wound. That infection was the real danger now, that she wasn't doing it for him, but because she'd closed a wound with improvised materials, and her professional conscience wouldn't let her walk away without confirming it wasn't going septic. All of that was true. She stood in the hallway and she had all of it lined up, reasonable and clinical and completely defensible. He opened the door before she finished knocking. He'd changed his shirt. The new one was dark, which was practical. He was upright, which was more than she'd have bet on 3 hours ago. His color was better, marginally. He was still holding himself slightly wrong, weight shifted right, the unconscious accommodation of a body protecting an injury. But he'd combed his hair and his face was composed in the particular way she was already learning to recognize as his default. A surface so controlled, it told you nothing except that there was a great deal being controlled underneath it. "I need to check the wound," she said. "It's fine." "You don't know that. I've had worse." "That's not the reassurance you think it is." She held up the small bag she'd packed. 10 minutes. I look at it. I tell you if you need anything different, and then I leave you alone." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He stepped back from the door. She came in. The apartment in daylight was different. She hadn't been able to see much of it at 6 in the morning. She'd been focused on the floor, on him, on the work. Now she could see the whole of it, and what she saw confirmed what she'd already suspected. No photographs. No art on the walls. The furniture was expensive and impersonal, chosen for function or chosen by someone who'd been told to furnish a space and had done so without any sense of who lived in it. A single bookshelf with books that had been read, she could tell from the spines, but arranged without sentiment. A laptop on the kitchen table. Nothing else. She thought about her own apartment with its 4 plates and its bare walls, and understood that she and this man had arrived at a similar aesthetic through completely different routes. She'd stripped her space down out of necessity. The way his apartment felt, she thought he'd stripped his down out of something older than that. She didn't say any of this. "Sit," she said, and pointed at the kitchen table. He sat. She pulled on gloves and moved to him, and he lifted his shirt without being asked, which meant he'd already looked at it himself, which meant some part of him had wanted it checked, and the performance at the door had been, what? Habit. She was starting to think habit covered a lot of ground with Dominic Moretti. The wound was holding. The closures were intact. No heat, no weeping, no early signs of the infection she'd feared. She prodded the surrounding tissue carefully, and he didn't flinch, which impressed her more than she wanted it to. "You have a fever," she said. His skin was warm in the way that meant the body was working hard. Not dangerously warm, working hard, warm. "I know. You should be resting. I have things to manage. Your things nearly killed you 12 hours ago." He looked at her steadily. "They didn't." She stripped the gloves and dropped them in his trash and stood up, and he was watching her with that careful, measuring attention that she'd have found threatening once. and maybe should still find threatening now, except that she'd been in this apartment for 40 minutes, and the gun that had been in his hand this morning was nowhere visible, and the man in front of her had known her secret for over a year and done nothing with it. She didn't understand him. That bothered her. She was good at reading people. She'd had to become good at it. And he didn't resolve into anything she recognized. "I need to ask you something," she said. "You've been deciding whether to ask it since you came in." She ignored that. "Last night, what happened?" The quality of the silence that followed was different from his ordinary silences. This one had weight. "Business disagreement," he said. "Someone stabbed you." "Yes." "In your own home." "They didn't start there." She looked at the floor where she'd found him. Someone had cleaned it. Recently, thoroughly, the kind of cleaning that required effort. She looked back at him. "Who are you?" she asked again. The same question she'd asked that morning. She said it the same way, but it meant something different now, in daylight, with more information around the edges of it. He considered her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was running a calculation she couldn't see the variables of. "Someone who made a certain number of choices," he said, "a long time ago, that determined the shape of everything after." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." He paused. "You haven't left." The subject change was deliberate. She noted it and didn't pursue the other thread because she understood functionally that pushing him was not going to produce more than he intended to give. Whatever he was, and she had her suspicions now, standing in this careful, empty apartment, looking at the scar on his jaw and the way he'd had a surgical-quality wound closure kit above his refrigerator. He was not going to lay it out for her. Not because he was ashamed of it, because he'd made peace with what it was a long time ago. "No," she said. "I haven't." "Why?" She picked up her bag. She took her time answering because the honest answer required locating it first, and the honest answer was the only one she had. "Because you were right," she said, "about the system, about it not being enough." She said it flat, without drama, the same way she'd say it in a chart note, factual. "And because I don't know what comes next if I run again." He was quiet. Then, "Sit down." She looked at the chair across from him. She sat. "Tell me about him," Dominic said. She hadn't told anyone. Not in 3 years, not since she'd left Seattle with a bruised rib and a plan, and a level of focus that had scared her a little in retrospect. The cold ferocity of a person who has stopped hoping things will improve and started building a way out instead. She hadn't told Priya, who was kind and persistent and deserved a real friend instead of the facsimile Harper offered. She hadn't told anyone at work. She hadn't told her mother, who had stopped calling after Harper changed her number the second time, and whose silence on the other end of that decision was its own kind of wound she didn't let herself look at directly. She told Dominic Moretti. She told him flatly, the same way she'd presented clinical findings at an intake. Brandon Reeves. Old family money, Pacific Northwest. They'd met when she was 27, and she'd thought, she paused here, not for drama, but because the memory had a particular quality to it, the stupefying ordinariness of how it had started. She'd thought he was exciting, confident, the kind of man who knew what he wanted and went after it. "He does know what he wants," she said. "That part I had right." The control had been gradual. She understood now, in a way she hadn't at the time, how incremental it had been. Each thing so small on its own. The mild commentary on her friendships that became preferences about who she spent time with. The questions about her schedule that became a requirement to account for her time. The first time he grabbed her arm, he apologized for 3 days straight, and she'd believed every word of it, because she was a person who believed in the repair of things, and because she'd loved him, and because nobody wants to be the woman in that story. "The last night," she said, "he fractured 2 of my ribs and dislocated my shoulder and then sat in our kitchen and told me that if I left, he would find me, and that when he did, it would be worse." She said it without inflection. "He also said he would ruin my career. He had the contacts to do it. He knew the board members at every hospital in Seattle." "So you disappeared." "I made sure he couldn't follow me. New name, new license, new city. I studied how people get found, and I avoided every one of those routes." She looked at her hands. "I've been careful." "You have," he said. It wasn't condescending. It was the same assessment she'd give a patient who'd managed their own care under difficult conditions. Accurate. Insufficient, but accurate. "He has money," she said, And he's patient. Those are a bad combination. Yes, Dominic said. They are. She looked at him across the table. His hands were resting in front of him, very still, and she could see the old marks on his knuckles, the kind of marks that came from a particular kind of life, not from a single incident. His eyes were on her face, and she had the unusual sensation of being seen without being read for vulnerability, which was different from how most people looked at her when they knew pieces of her story. "Why does it matter to you?" she said. "Really?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he actually thought about it rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. "Because you came through that door this morning when every sensible reason said don't," he said. "And because the man you're describing is a particular kind of person I have a particular kind of dislike for." He paused. "And because you are my neighbor, and what happens on this floor is my concern. That's 3 reasons." "Yes." "Which one is the real one?" His mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one, there and gone. "All 3, he said. His name came through to Brandon Reeves on a Thursday evening. Brandon was in his suite at the Four Seasons on Boylston, 2 rooms because he'd stopped being able to sleep in the same room where he conducted business. And he was on the phone with the man he paid to find things, a former federal investigator named Cutler, who had a gift for the kind of research that didn't leave footprints. "She's been at the Whitmore on Commonwealth for 14 months, Cutler said, working under the name Harper Cole, trauma nurse at Mass General, nights." A pause. "She's good, Mr. Reeves. Whoever helped her build the cover did solid work." Brandon was standing at the window looking at the public garden, which was green and ordinary and completely indifferent to him. He'd been in Boston for 11 days, the first 4 of which had produced nothing, and the patience he liked to think of as one of his better qualities had been thinning in a way he didn't discuss with anyone. "What floor?" 4. Apartment 4C. Another pause, and Brandon recognized the quality of it. Cutler preparing to give him something he hadn't asked for, but that the man thought he should know. "What?" Brandon said. "Her neighbor in 4D, name's Dominic Moretti. On paper he's a consultant, financial advisory services, registered in Delaware, a few shell entities." Cutler's voice was careful now. "Off paper is a different matter. I'm seeing connections to 3 separate organized crime investigations over the last 12 years, none of which resulted in charges. Interpol has a file on him, nothing actionable. He's very clean for someone whose name appears in very dirty places." Brandon processed this. "How close are they?" "Unknown. She's been there 14 months. He's been there longer." No documented interaction. Brandon looked at the garden. The last light was leaving it, the green going gray. "It doesn't matter," he said. "She doesn't get to decide when this is over." "Mr. Reeves, I need a team," Brandon said. "Not process servers, not lawyers. A team that can manage an extraction cleanly." Silence on the line. "That's a significant escalation," Cutler said. "I'm aware of what it is." Brandon's voice was even. People sometimes mistook his evenness for calm. It wasn't calm. It was the particular flatness of a man who had decided something and was now only interested in logistics. "Find me the team, 12 men minimum. I want them in place by Monday." He hung up. He stood at the window for a little longer. Harper, he thought, running, building her little system, thinking she'd finally gotten far enough. He almost felt something like admiration for it, the effort of it. 14 months, new name, new city. She'd worked hard. It wasn't going to be enough. Harper found out on Friday night, indirectly, in the way bad information often arrived, through the edge of something else. She was leaving for her shift, bag over her shoulder, earbuds in but not playing anything. She used them as a social signal, the universal "do not approach." When she came out of the stairwell on the ground floor and nearly walked into a man she'd never seen before. He was standing in the lobby near the mailboxes, which was a place people stood, except that people who lived in the building moved through the lobby with the half-conscious ease of familiarity, and this man was positioned with the alert stillness of someone who was observing rather than transiting. He was big, casually dressed, and his eyes went to her face the instant she appeared, and then, too fast, with the practiced indifference of someone who'd noticed that he'd been noticed, went to his phone. Harper walked past him and through the front door and down the steps without changing her pace. She was half a block away before she pulled out her actual phone and typed a message to the number she'd programmed in 2 days ago, the one Dominic had given her without explanation or ceremony, just written on a piece of paper and handed to her when she left his apartment on Wednesday, and said, "Only call this if something feels wrong." "Something feels wrong," she typed. "Man in the lobby. Never seen him before. Watching the mailboxes." She put the phone away and kept walking and made herself breathe at a normal rate, because panicking on a public street was both useless and visible. The reply came 40 seconds later. "Don't go back tonight. Go to work. I'll handle it." She stopped on the sidewalk. She stared at the message. She typed, "What does handle it mean?" The reply, "It means you don't need to worry about the lobby." She stood there in the November cold with her bag and her earbuds and the message on her screen and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. A sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. She was not alone in this. She didn't know if that was better or worse. She didn't know what it cost. She didn't know what Dominic Moretti's protection meant in practical terms, what it required, what it made her. She knew that accepting help from a man whose apartment contained things she hadn't looked at too closely and whose name appeared, apparently, in organized crime investigations was not a neutral act. She knew that. She went to work. The man in the lobby was gone by 8 o'clock. Dominic's people. She'd seen enough now to understand that there were people, that the man through the wall was not operating alone, that the calls he made produced results that she didn't witness the mechanism of, had moved him with no visible confrontation and no police involvement. She found this out because Dominic called her at 8:15 during her break and told her in the same even tone he used for everything. "Who was he?" she said. "Advance work," Dominic said. "Someone is mapping the building, access points, staffing patterns, shift schedules for the concierge." Her throat tightened. "Brandon?" "Most likely." A pause. "How long has he been in Boston?" "I don't know. I didn't know he was here." She pressed her back against the break room wall and made herself keep her voice steady. "How do you know he's mapping the building?" "Because that's what I would do," Dominic said, without any affect in it, just information. "And because the man we removed from your lobby was carrying a floor plan, the floor plan of the Whitmore, of her building, of the floor where she slept and where the go-bag was behind the water heater and where her 4 plates were stacked in a cabinet in a kitchen she'd been careful not to make feel like home." "Harper," Dominic said. She registered distantly that it was the first time he'd used her name. "I'm here," she said. "When your shift ends, don't go back to your apartment." He said it with a calm so complete it left no room for the panic she could feel pressing at the back of her sternum. "Come directly to my door. Bring nothing except what you came to work with tonight. I have things in that apartment. I'll have them moved. You can't just—" "Harper." Quiet. Absolute. The voice of a man who had managed a great many emergencies and had learned that the margin between managed and lost was almost always held by the person who kept their head. "Do you trust me?" She thought about the gun pointed at her face. She thought about the way he'd looked at her across his kitchen table and the 3 reasons, all of them real. She thought about the floor plan in a stranger's hands. "Not entirely," she said, because it was true. "That's fair," he said. "Come anyway." She stood in the break room with the phone in her hand after he'd hung up and looked at the door and thought about all the things she'd built in 14 months. The system, the silence, the bare walls that were starting to feel, in the worst way, like something she'd abandoned rather than chosen. She thought about Priya, who had been trying to give her a real friendship for 6 months. She thought about her mother's silence. She thought about Brandon standing in her old apartment with her spare key between his fingers, patient as a hunting dog, absolutely certain she would run out of places to go. She worked the rest of her shift. At 6 in the morning, she walked out of Mass General and turned toward Commonwealth Avenue, and she did not let herself hesitate at the corner, did not let herself stand on the sidewalk doing the calculation one more time, because she'd done it during every break and every quiet moment of the last 10 hours, and it kept coming out the same. She went straight to the Whitmore. She took the elevator to 4. She knocked on the door of 4D. Dominic opened it immediately, which meant he'd been waiting, which was its own kind of information. He stepped back. She came in. The apartment looked the same as it had on Wednesday, spare, controlled, telling you nothing, except that there were 2 men she'd never seen before sitting at his kitchen table with laptops open, and they both looked up at her when she entered with the assessing, impersonal attention of professionals. "My people," Dominic said, which explained nothing, and apparently everything. She looked at the two men. She looked at Dominic. She looked at the door she'd just come through, and the hallway she'd crossed, and the elevator she'd ridden up, and she understood in a way that was almost physical. The sensation of a door closing at her back, that the life she'd been running in apartment 4C was over. She had just walked out of one kind of survival and into another kind entirely, and she had no idea yet what this one was going to cost her. Dominic's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something crossed his face. Not quite alarm, but the cousin of it. The tightening of a man who has just received confirmation of something he'd hoped to be wrong about. He looked up at her. "He's here," Dominic said. "Brandon Reeves checked out of the Four Seasons this morning. He moved his entire team." Harper's stomach dropped. "Where?" she said. "3 blocks away." Dominic set the phone down and looked at her with the dark, steady attention she was learning to read. Not as cold, but as the particular focus of a man who had just shifted from managing a situation to going to war with it. "He's not doing advance work anymore." The two men at the table closed their laptops simultaneously, without being told. "He's moving," Dominic said. The two men at the table were already moving. Not scrambling. Moving, which was different. The difference between people reacting to a crisis and people executing a plan they had already made. The taller one, dark-skinned, with a jaw like a construction beam, went to the window and looked down at the street below with the particular attention of someone reading the ground for information, not scenery. The other one, shorter, sandy-haired, with the kind of stillness that reminded Harper of a coiled spring, was on a phone speaking in a low voice she couldn't quite catch, and whatever he was saying produced on the other end the sound of immediate compliance. Dominic was watching her. She understood that he was watching her process it, the same way she watched patients in the first seconds after catastrophic news, not for weakness, but to calibrate, to know what he was working with. 3 blocks, she said again. The Marlowe. He took 4 rooms on the 8th floor. Dominic picked up his phone again, scrolled, set it face down on the table. He moved out of the Four Seasons at 5 this morning. That means he was planning the move last night, which means he already had a location secured before he put the man in your lobby yesterday. He was already ahead of us. He was operating on a parallel timeline. Dominic said it without apology or reassurance, just the fact of it. He's been building toward this for longer than we knew. Harper set her bag down on the floor. It was a deliberate act, something to do with her hands while her mind caught up with her body, which had already understood, on some animal level, that the shape of everything had just changed. She'd been running from Brandon Reeves for 3 years. She'd built a life around the assumption that he was somewhere behind her, closing the distance slowly. Finding out he was 3 blocks away and had been planning his approach while she worked a trauma shift and believed herself to be invisible was not a new fear. It was the confirmation of the one she'd had all along, which somehow made it worse. "What does moving his team mean in practical terms?" she said. Dominic looked at the man by the window. Reyes. Reyes, the tall one, turned from the window. 8 men we've confirmed. Probably 2 or 3 more we haven't. Ex-military, most of them, private contractor background. The kind of team you hire when you need something done fast and clean and you don't want paperwork. Legal? Operating inside it. Barely. Reyes glanced at her. He's packaging this as a welfare check through a private security firm. Has documentation that could pass an initial look. A physician's statement saying the subject is mentally compromised. A power of attorney filing. He paused. It's paper. But it's paper that slows response time if anyone calls it in. Harper heard the word subject and felt something cold move through her. That was what Brandon had done. Converted her into a subject. Given her a diagnosis on paper that made abduction look like concern. He's done this before, she said. Reyes looked at Dominic. Say it, Harper said. There was a woman in Portland, Dominic said. His voice was even. 2 years ago. A situation with a similar documentation structure. She didn't... He stopped. Chose the next word with care. It didn't resolve well for her. The room was quiet. Harper looked at the floor for a moment. The carpet in Dominic's apartment was charcoal gray, the kind of carpet chosen by someone who wanted no opinions about it. She looked at it and breathed and did what she'd learned to do in trauma bays when something terrible was already done and couldn't be undone. She filed it and moved forward. What's your plan? She said. We make you impossible to move, Dominic said. You stay here. The building has systems he doesn't know about. We tighten everything today. Access points, elevator control, external camera coverage. I have 4 more people I can bring in by this afternoon. And Brandon? Brandon Reeves will find that the operation he's planned is encountering complications. She looked at him. That's not an answer. It's the answer you should have for now. He said it without condescension, the way a surgeon said we'll address that when we get there. Not evasion, but triage. Do you want the specifics of how I manage threats, or do you want to trust that I've managed them before? She thought about the cabinet above his refrigerator, the wound closure kit, the 2 men who'd appeared in his apartment with laptops and moved without being asked. I want both, she said. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, but changed, the way very controlled things changed when they registered something unexpected. He nodded once. Fair, he said. Sit down. None. He told her the shape of it. Not everything. She understood there were dimensions he wasn't sharing, and for the moment she chose not to push them because she had enough information to be useful and not enough to be paralyzed. What she understood, the Whitmore had more security infrastructure than its lobby suggested. Dominic had been involved in the building's renovation 6 years ago, which had included, she let herself absorb this without commentary, the installation of a secondary security system that did not appear on any of the building's official documentation. Camera coverage on all 4 stairwells, both elevator banks, the loading dock, the service entrance, and every external approach within 40 meters of the building. A reinforced door on the 4th floor fire exit, and something on the roof that Reyes referred to only as the countermeasure, which Dominic did not elaborate on and Harper did not ask about directly. You built a fortress, she said. I built a home I could defend, Dominic said. There's a difference. She thought about that. She wasn't sure she saw the difference, but she let it go. By noon, there were 6 people in Dominic's apartment, 4 of whom Harper had never seen before. They were introduced by first name only, Reyes, Costa, Lim, Park, and 2 others whose names she immediately forgot because she was running on 3 hours of sleep and the particular hypervigilance that came with an acute threat, which felt paradoxically like a kind of numbness. Everyone was professional. Nobody looked at her like a problem or a complication. She understood after a while that Dominic had communicated something to these people about how she was to be treated, and that what he'd communicated had been received and acted on without debate. She didn't know what to do with that either. At 2 in the afternoon, she finally slept. Dominic gave her his bedroom without discussing it, pointed at the door, said sleep, left no room for argument. And she was too exhausted to perform the protest she'd have made if she'd had more capacity, so she went in and lay down on a bed that was firm and impersonal, and smelled faintly of something she couldn't identify, and she was unconscious in approximately 4 minutes. She woke up at 6:30 to the sound of raised voices. Not loud voices. Raised for Dominic Moretti's apartment, which had a high bar for volume given how its primary occupant communicated, meant 2 people speaking with sharp, fast energy in the kitchen. Harper sat up in the dark and oriented herself. This is not your apartment. This is 4D. You are not in danger. That is not Brandon's voice. And then she went to the door and opened it. Dominic was at the kitchen table. Across from him was a man she'd never seen before, and it took her approximately 3 seconds to understand from the energy in the room that this man's presence was not planned. He was somewhere in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been attractive once, and now wore the history of too many decisions poorly made. He was dressed well, expensive coat, good shoes, but his hands on the table were not still, which told her something about how composed he actually was underneath the clothes. He looked at her when she came out of the bedroom. His eyes were evaluating in a way that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the instinct of a man who sorted people into categories quickly. Who is she? He said. Not a question, a complaint. That's not your concern, Dominic said. Harper leaned against the wall and folded her arms and said nothing, which was the correct tactical position. She was in a room where she understood approximately half the dynamics, and the half she didn't understand was represented by the man across from Dominic, and she'd learned a long time ago that in rooms like that, you watched before you spoke. You have a problem, the man said to Dominic. You have a very specific problem that is about to become a problem for other people who did not invite it. Corelli, Dominic said, just the name, a single word with a contained warning in it. I'm not here to argue. I'm here because 3 of the 5 families have concerns. And when 3 of the 5 have concerns, Nico Corelli gets on a plane and has a conversation. The man, Corelli, spread his hands. You've been drawing attention. The situation last week with your injury. People noticed movement. People notice when Moretti's people start circulating around a residential building on Commonwealth. My building is my business. Your building becomes shared business when the activity around it creates visibility that we all pay for. Corelli's voice was flat but not angry. The voice of a man delivering a message, not starting a fight. There is a man named Reeves who has hired a private security team. We know who he is. We know what he's here for. His eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to Harper, and then back to Dominic. Cut him loose, let him take what he came for and leave. The visibility drops, the situation resolves, and your distraction is no longer a problem for anyone except herself. The silence that followed that was a specific kind of silence, the kind that had weight and shape and was being used by the person generating it as a tool. Dominic looked at Corelli for a very long time. His hands were flat on the table, relaxed, the way his hands were always relaxed, and Harper had come to understand that this particular stillness was not passivity. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided and was waiting for the other person to finish. No, Dominic said. Corelli's expression shifted. Dominic, she is under my protection. He said it the same way he said everything, quiet, absolute, with the specific quality of a thing that had been decided and was no longer a subject for discussion. That is not negotiable, and it was not a request. The families can have whatever concerns they like. Dominic leaned forward very slightly. I've respected every boundary, honored every agreement, and stayed out of every situation that wasn't mine for 12 years. This situation is mine. The answer is no. Corelli looked at him. He looked at Harper. He looked back at Dominic, and she could see him doing the calculation. Whatever Dominic was in the hierarchy of whatever this was, the calculation was producing an answer that Corelli didn't like but was going to accept. If this blows up, Corelli said, it blows up on you. That's always been the case, Dominic said. Corelli stood. He buttoned his coat with the careful deliberateness of a man reassembling his composure around him, like armor. He looked at Harper one more time, and she held his gaze, and he left. Harper didn't move from the wall for a moment. How many people, she said, just told you to hand me over? 3, Dominic said, through one messenger. And you said no. I said no. She pushed off the wall and came to the table and sat down across from where Corelli had been sitting. And she looked at Dominic Moretti, really looked at him, the way she looked at things when she needed to understand them and not just manage them. Why? She said. He met her eyes. I already answered that. Answer it again. A pause. Because some things are not for sale, and some people are not negotiable, he said. And because I said she was under my protection, and I don't say things I don't mean. She sat with that. Outside, the city was going dark, and somewhere 3 blocks away, Brandon Reeves was in a hotel room on the 8th floor with 8 men and paperwork that called her mentally compromised. And the man across from her had just told 3 organized crime families on her behalf. She didn't have a category for this. She'd run out of categories. The breach in the system came from a direction she hadn't considered, which was how the worst things always arrived. It was Priya. Harper understood it at 9:17 the following morning, when Dominic set his phone on the table and pushed it toward her without speaking, and she looked at the screen and saw the message from the number she'd given Priya 6 months ago for genuine emergencies. The number she'd said, call this only if something happens at work that I need to know about immediately. The message said, Harper, someone came to the hospital asking about you, said he was your brother. I didn't tell him anything, but I'm scared I might have said something small I didn't realize. I'm so sorry. He knew your schedule. He knew your unit. Please be careful. Harper read it twice. Dominic was watching her face. She didn't know, Harper said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Priya didn't know. No, he agreed. She said something small. She set the phone down. Her hands were cold, which was a physiological response to the adrenaline. She knew that. It didn't mean anything except that her body was processing at a different speed than her mind. What could she have said that he didn't already know? Where you park? What entrance you use? What time you normally leave? Dominic listed them without drama. Any one of those is enough to set an intercept point. I haven't been back to the hospital since Friday. He doesn't know that. Dominic picked up his phone. He's going to be watching Mass General's main entrance at 6 in the morning. He paused. Which means he's divided his team. Part of it here, part of it at the hospital. She processed this. He split his resources. To cover both exits, Dominic said, which tells us something. He's not waiting anymore. No, Dominic said. He's not. She looked at the wall. She thought about Priya. Kind, patient Priya, who had been trying to give her a real friendship for 6 months, and had now been put in the path of this without ever knowing what this was. She thought about what Brandon had done to get that small piece of information, whether he'd been charming, which he was excellent at, or whether he'd been something else. Is she safe? Harper said. Dominic was already on the phone. He said something in Italian she didn't catch. He listened. He said something else, hung up. Someone will watch her building, he said. She won't know. Harper nodded. She was doing the thing she did in trauma, filing, moving forward, not letting the feeling land until there was a moment where it was safe to let it land. That moment was not now. I need to know the full plan, she said. Not the shape of it, the specific plan. I'm done getting pieces. Dominic looked at her for a moment, then, all right. He told her. He told her all of it. The camera systems, the elevator controls, the 4 operatives he had covering the external approaches, the countermeasure on the roof, which turned out to be a signal jammer that could be activated from his phone and would kill every cellular and radio frequency within a 200-meter radius, isolating the building completely. He told her about the panic room behind the false wall in the bedroom closet, reinforced steel door, independent air supply, monitors fed by the secondary camera system, enough food and water for 72 hours. He told her about what happened to people who made the mistake of moving on something he considered his. He said that last part without raising his voice or changing his expression, and it was somehow the most frightening thing she'd heard in 3 years of being frightened. You've done this before, she said. Defended something I care about? He met her eyes. Yes. She registered the word care and chose not to examine it right now because there was too much else to process. And she was a person who had always been better at the immediate crisis than at the thing underneath it. There's something you're not telling me, she said. He was quiet. Dominic. The first time she'd used his name and she felt it. The slight shift in register, the change in what they were to each other that came with it. What are you not telling me? He looked at the table. When he looked back up, the thing in his face was not quite what she'd call emotion, but it was the closest she'd seen. There's a man inside the building, he said. We found him this morning. Maintenance contractor, brought in by building management 3 days ago for a routine inspection. He paused. He's not a maintenance contractor. The cold moved through her again. Brandon has someone inside, she said. Had, Dominic said. We've managed it. Managed it how? He's no longer in the building. She looked at him. Is he? He's alive, Dominic said. Uncomfortable, but alive. He held her gaze. He's also going to tell Brandon, when he reports in, that the woman in 4C is there alone, that there's minimal security on the floor, and that the elevator is accessible from the basement. Harper sat back. The shape of it landed on her all at once. You turned him, she said. We gave him a script, Dominic said. Brandon Reeves is going to receive information that tells him tonight is the optimal window, that the building is exposed, that the operation he's planned will succeed. He paused. He'll move tonight. He'll bring his full team, and he'll walk into a building that is nothing like what he's been told. She understood. Every piece of it, the architecture of it, the cold and perfect logic of it. She understood it, and she felt it in a way she hadn't expected. Not relief, not fear, but something that was almost like grief for the version of herself that had believed, for 3 years, that she was the only one who could see this clearly. And me, she said. Where am I in this plan? In this panic room, Dominic said. From the moment the first breach is confirmed until I tell you it's over. I don't... She stopped. She started again. I don't sit in rooms while other people handle my problems. Tonight you do. Dominic. Harper. The way he said it was different from how he'd said it before. Not commanding, not cold, something underneath that. You are the person he's coming for. If he finds you before I find him, nothing else matters. The room is not about keeping you out of the fight. It's about making sure there is no fight if I fail. But the room exists for the possibility that I'm wrong. She looked at him. She thought about 3 years of running. She thought about the spare key between Brandon's fingers. She thought about a 17-year-old on a motorcycle and a woman who coded twice, and all the nights she'd pressed her palm to a door she didn't fully trust. If something goes wrong, she said, if it goes badly, I need to know. It won't. If it does, she said, pressing, needing the answer. Do I have a way out that's not dependent on you? A pause. The room has a secondary exit, he said. Service corridor comes out on the second floor east stairwell. I'll give you the code. She nodded. Okay. Okay? He said, like he'd expected more resistance and was recalibrating. I said okay. She met his eyes. I trust the plan. I don't trust the margin of error. Give me the code and I'll stay in the room. He gave it to her. She memorized it the way she memorized drug dosages. Immediately, absolutely, filed behind a wall where panic couldn't reach it. At 4 in the afternoon, Dominic's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He set it down. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen once before. Not quite alarm, not quite its cousin, but the tightening of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd hoped to be wrong about. But this time it was different. This time the expression resolved into something harder and colder than it had been before, and she understood from the quality of it that whatever the phone had just told him had changed the geometry of the situation in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. What? She said. Brandon Reeves just made a phone call, Dominic said. To the same man who came to see me yesterday. The cold came back. Corelli, she said. Brandon Reeves and Nico Corelli have a prior relationship, Dominic said. His voice was completely even. The evenness was doing a great deal of work. A financial relationship. I did not know this until 40 seconds ago. Harper looked at him. She looked at the door Corelli had walked out of the previous night. She looked at the 2 men with laptops who had been in this apartment, who had access to Dominic's security plans, his camera systems, his countermeasures. The information Brandon has, she said, slowly, about the building, about tonight, about the building being accessible. Dominic said nothing. It didn't come only from the man inside, she said, or it didn't come from him at all. Dominic looked at the table. When he looked up, she saw something she hadn't seen in him before. Not fear, he was not a man who feared in the ordinary way, but the specific expression of a person who has discovered that the ground beneath a plan they believed was solid was, in fact, compromised at its foundation. Corelli gave him the security layout, Dominic said. The secondary system, the camera positions. He paused. The location of the panic room. The silence that followed was not like his ordinary silences. Harper's throat was dry. She processed it in pieces, because all at once it was too much. The man who had come to tell Dominic to hand her over had walked out of this apartment knowing its every defended position and gone directly to Brandon Reeves. The plan Dominic had built, the fortress, the countermeasures, the signal jammer, the 67 steps between Brandon and Harper, had been mapped and transmitted to the person it was built against. Everything they'd prepared was known. The panic room, she said. If they know where it is. They know where it is, Dominic confirmed. His voice was still even. She didn't know how. Then I can't go in it. No, he said. You can't. She stood up from the table. Her legs held, which was good, because there was a version of this moment where they might not have. She stood and she breathed and she looked at the man across from her. The man who had said no to 3 families, who had told her she was his responsibility, who had built a plan around keeping her safe and discovered that the plan was already in the hands of the person it was built against. She thought about all the things she was. A nurse, a fugitive, a woman who had rebuilt herself from almost nothing, twice, under circumstances that would have destroyed someone with a less unyielding relationship with survival. She thought about what she was going to have to be now, in a building whose defenses were compromised, with a man coming who had paper that said she wasn't real, whose team knew the secondary exit and the camera positions and the location of the room that was supposed to save her. Tell me, she said. Her voice was steady. She was still proud of it. What do we actually have left? Dominic looked at her across the table, and for the first time she saw in his face not the managed control of a man who had handled everything, but the grim, stripped-down clarity of a man who was about to fight with what remained after the plan was gone. "We have tonight," he said, "and we have each other." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and it was also the most terrifying, because it meant that everything she had been depending on, the systems, the preparation, the infrastructure of survival she'd believed was finally solid, had been pulled from underneath her, and what was left was a 6-hour window before Brandon Reeves brought his team through the front door of a building that was no longer a fortress. It was just an apartment building, and she was just a woman who had run out of places to hide. 6 hours. That was what they had, and Dominic did not waste a single minute of it on anything that wasn't useful. He made 4 calls in the first 20 minutes, standing at the kitchen window with his back to the room, speaking in a voice too low for Harper to catch the words, but not the tone. Clipped, precise. The tone of a man issuing instructions he expected to be followed exactly and immediately. When he turned back, his face had the look of someone who had taken a bad hand and decided to play it anyway. "Reyes and Costa are out," he said. "Corelli's people got to them." Harper felt that land. "Got to them how?" "They're not coming back tonight." He said it flat, not elaborating on what that meant, and she decided not to ask. "I have Lim and Park, and 2 others who weren't in the building when Corelli's people were here." "4, she said. 4. He met her eyes. "Against 8, possibly 10, who have the layout of this building and 2 hours of preparation." She didn't say anything. "And you," he said. "I'm not a fighter." "No," he agreed. "But you know the building's medical limitations, you know how shock presents, and you have the clearest head of anyone in this room right now." He looked at her steadily. "I need you functional, not hidden. The panic room is compromised, but you're not going into it anyway. You're going to be my second set of eyes." She absorbed that. "The monitors." "The secondary system feeds to a tablet." He went to the kitchen drawer and pulled one out. Military-grade casing, the kind of thing that bounced instead of broke. "The positions Corelli gave Brandon are the ones from the main system. The secondary has 4 cameras he didn't know about. Back stairwell east, the service corridor, the roof access, and the lobby ceiling mount." He pulled up the feed and handed it to her. "You watch. You tell me where they are before they're where they think they're going." She took the tablet. On the screen, the lobby was empty. The concierge desk was vacant. She noticed that and looked at Dominic. "Staff has been cleared," he said. "Building residents were quietly advised of a maintenance emergency. The 4 floors above and below us are empty." "You moved an entire building in 6 hours." "I moved the people who needed to be safe," he said. "The rest of the building is prepared." She thought about what prepared meant in Dominic Moretti's vocabulary and decided this was also not the moment to ask. They ate. It was a practical act, not a comfortable one. Dominic made something fast in the kitchen, pasta and tinned tomatoes. The kind of meal that existed to put fuel in the body rather than pleasure in anything. And they ate it standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt wrong somehow, too domestic for what the next few hours contained. Harper ate without tasting it and watched the tablet and thought about Brandon Reeves on the 8th floor of the Marlowe 3 blocks away, looking at a map of this building that he believed was accurate. "Tell me about the first time," she said. Dominic looked at her. "The first time what?" "The first time you had to defend something." She kept her eyes on the tablet. "You said you'd done it before." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I was 24. Someone took something from me. I got it back." He paused. "The cost of getting it back was considerable." "What did they take?" "My brother," he said. She looked at him then. I was looking at the counter, his expression the same as always, controlled, level, but underneath the level, she could see the thing that had never fully healed, the way she could see the structural damage in a body that had mended wrong. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," he said. Force of habit, the same thing he'd said to her the first morning. But the edge was gone from it. She looked back at the tablet. "Did you get him back?" A pause. "I got him back alive." He picked up his fork. "The rest is more complicated." She didn't push it. She understood complicated in that context. She lived in it. At 9:15, Lim came in from the hallway and said 2 words. "They're moving." The first thing Brandon's team did was cut the power. It happened at 9:47, and Harper knew it was coming because she saw it on the tablet. A man in the basement utility corridor who spent 40 seconds at the breaker panel, and then the lobby camera went dark, and then the hallway cameras, and then the elevator indicator lights died. And the building fell into the particular blackness of a structure that has had its electricity removed rather than simply turned off. Total, sudden, absolute. She was standing next to Dominic when it happened. In the darkness, she could hear him breathe, slow, controlled, deliberately slow in the way of someone who was managing their own body chemistry with the same discipline they managed everything else. Secondary power, he said. Lim, somewhere to her left in the dark, activated something. The tablet in Harper's hands flickered and came back. The secondary camera system ran on a separate circuit. She'd been told this, but understanding it intellectually and experiencing it in total darkness were different things, and the relief when the screen lit up was physical, a loosening in her chest that she immediately tightened again. 3 in the lobby, she said, reading the screen. They came through the east service entrance, the door that's supposed to be alarmed. It alarmed, Dominic said. They cut it externally. Corelli gave them the alarm codes, she said. Yes. She watched the screen. The 3 men in the lobby were moving toward the stairwell with the efficient, unhurried purpose of people who believed they knew exactly what they were walking into. They were dressed in tactical gear, dark, unmarked, the kind of thing that could pass for legitimate private security or could pass for something else entirely, depending on who was asking. 2 more in the east stairwell, she said. Ground floor landing, moving up. She paused. They're not going to 4 directly. They're going to 3, Dominic said. Clear the floor below first, standard breach protocol. She watched them do it. Methodical, practiced, the 2 men moving through the 3rd floor hallway with handheld lights, checking each door, moving on. She understood now why Dominic had cleared the building. She felt the cold understanding of what would have happened to anyone still in those rooms. What about the other 3? She counted on the screen. You said 8 minimum. Roof access, Dominic said. And the front. The front is covered? Park, he said. She didn't ask what that meant in specific terms. Go to the bedroom, Dominic said. Stay against the interior wall. Do not open the closet. The door still reads as a panic room entry on their layout. They'll breach it first if they come through this apartment. Let them. Where will you be? Hallway, he said. His voice was completely level, and she hated it. Not the levelness, but the fact that she'd come to read the undertones beneath it. And what was underneath it right now was the particular calm of a person who has made peace with the immediate possibility of serious harm to themselves. Dominic, Harper. He turned to her in the dark. She couldn't see his face, but she knew the quality of his attention on her. She'd learned it by now, the way it felt different from every other kind of attention she'd experienced. Stay against the wall. Keep the tablet. Tell me where they are. She grabbed his arm. 1 second, 1 grip, her fingers finding his forearm in the dark. Don't get killed, she said. A pause. I have been trying very hard not to, he said. She let go. She went to the bedroom. The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life, and she had lived through some long ones. She sat against the interior bedroom wall with the tablet on her knees and her back straight, and her breathing as controlled as she could keep it, and she watched men move through the building on a 4-inch screen and fed their positions to Dominic through an earpiece he'd put in her ear before he went into the hallway. And she did this with the same focused compartmentalization she used in trauma, because the alternative was panic, and panic was a luxury she absolutely could not afford. The 2 men from the east stairwell hit the 4th floor at 10:11. She saw them on the stairwell camera, the secondary angle, the one Corelli hadn't given Brandon. And she said, 4th floor landing now, moving toward the east corridor, into the earpiece. And she heard Dominic's voice come back, 1 word, confirmed. She heard, rather than saw, what happened next. 2 sharp sounds she'd never heard in person before, but recognized immediately from every year she'd worked trauma. The particular report of a suppressed weapon. And then a heavier sound, and then silence. And she looked at the tablet, and the east corridor was empty of the 2 men who had been there. She breathed. Clear, Dominic said. 3 in the lobby are coming up, she said. They heard something. They're accelerating. How far? 2nd floor landing. Dean. Give me 30 seconds. She counted. She watched the screen. She pressed her back against the wall and felt the building around her. The dark weight of it, the structure she'd lived in for 14 months and never fully trusted. And that was now the only thing between her and the end of the life she'd built. The 30 seconds passed. Something happened in the stairwell that she couldn't fully read from the camera angle. Movement. Fast. And then 2 of the 3 men from the lobby were no longer moving, and the third was backing against the stairwell wall with his hands raised. "Got him," Lim's voice said in her ear. "The other team on the roof," she said. 3 men, still on the roof access camera. They're not moving. "They're waiting for signal," Dominic said. She could hear him breathing now. Slightly faster, the first deviation from his controlled baseline, which told her more than anything else could about what the last 4 minutes had cost him physically. The wound in his side. 6 days old, improvised closure, and he was moving through dark hallways taking down armed men. When they don't get it, they'll move. "What do we do?" "We give them a signal," he said. "Lim." She heard something she didn't understand. A radio transmission, static, a voice she recognized after a moment as the man they'd captured in the stairwell, reading from something, his voice tight with the particular tension of someone who understood exactly what the incentives were. The message was brief. 3 words in what she thought was a code she didn't have the key for, but the 3 men on the roof received it, and the roof camera showed them relax, and they stayed where they were. She breathed again. "Brandon," she said. "Where is Brandon?" Silence in the earpiece. She looked at every camera. Lobby, empty. Stairwells, empty now. Service corridor, empty. The east approach from the street. "He's not in the building," she said. "No," Dominic said, a pause. "He's not going to come in until he's certain. He's watching from somewhere outside." "Yes." She sat with this. She looked at the tablet. "He's going to know something went wrong when nobody reports back." "Yes," Dominic said, "which means we have approximately 10 minutes before he makes a decision." She heard him coming back down the hallway. The bedroom door opened. He came in and she could see him now. Her eyes had adjusted to the ambient light coming through the window, and what she saw made her stomach tighten. He was holding his left arm slightly wrong, shoulder elevated, the unconscious accommodation of someone who had taken a blow, or worse to that side, and his face was dark with effort in a way it hadn't been before. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm functional." "That's not the same. Harper." He sat down against the wall next to her, which told her more than the words did. Dominic Moretti sat down when he needed to, and this was a need. He took the tablet from her and looked at it, and his jaw was tight. "Brandon Reeves has one path left. He's going to come in himself, because he can't trust anyone else to do this now. He'll bring whoever's left, the 3 on the roof, and anyone he kept back. Come through the front. Or the back." He looked at the screen. "He's predictable in one way only. He will not leave without you. That is not in his character." She knew this. She had known this for 3 years, the terrible engine of it, the way Brandon's pride and his obsession had fused into something that looked like determination and functioned like a disorder. "Then we use it," she said. Dominic looked at her. "He'll come for me," she said. "That's the only certainty we have left. So we use it." "You are not bait," he said. Hard, immediate. "I'm not offering to be bait." She held his gaze. "I'm saying we stop trying to predict where he goes, and we control where he goes. We bring him to us, to a place we've prepared." She paused. "You said the building was prepared. What does that mean, specifically?" A pause. He looked at her. She could see the evaluation in it. Not doubt, but the genuine assessment of whether what she was suggesting was operationally sound or emotionally driven, and she appreciated that he was making that distinction. "The lobby," he said slowly. "I have it configured. The entrance, the front desk, the elevator bank. If someone enters through the front, they're walking into a contained space." "Then that's where he goes," she said. "I make contact. I tell him I'm coming down. His pride won't let him stay outside once he thinks I'm walking toward him. If anything goes wrong in that lobby, then you're there," she said. "That's the plan. That's the whole plan." He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel his reluctance. Not fear. He didn't operate in fear the way ordinary people did, but the specific resistance of someone who had said she was his responsibility and was being asked to put that responsibility in the path of a threat. "He'll have the men from the roof," he said. How many of ours? Lim, Park is down. He said it without inflection, but she heard what it cost him. Park, the sandy-haired one, the coiled spring. Gone. She breathed. Lim and you. And you, he said. And me, she agreed. He reached into his jacket and put something in her hand. She looked at it. A compact device, black, 2 buttons, a small LED. If I go down, he said, and I mean that literally, if I am on the floor and not getting up, you press this. It activates everything that's still active in this building in one sequence. Doors, lights, alarms, the signal jammer at full power. It will disorient anyone in the building who isn't expecting it. And then you run, he said. Service corridor, 2nd floor, east stairwell, the code I gave you. You run and you don't stop. She looked at the device. She closed her hand around it. You're not going down, she said. No, he agreed. But you have the contingency. She made the call at 10:43. Brandon picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been holding his phone, which told her he was exactly as wound tight as she'd calculated. She stood in Dominic's kitchen in the dark with the tablet in one hand and the device in her pocket and her heart doing something loud and unpleasant in her chest that she breathed against until it steadied. Harper, his voice. 3 years and it still landed on her skin like something cold and unwanted. The particular warmth in it that had once seemed like affection and that she now understood was the warmth of a man who was pleased with the progress of a hunt. You're smarter than I thought. I'm coming down, she said. The lobby. 5 minutes. A silence. Why? Because I'm tired, she said. And this was true enough that it came out without performance. 3 years of tired. A building full of people who'd been put in danger because of her. A man with a hole in his side who had said no to 3 crime families and lost an operative and was still standing in a dark hallway because she was his responsibility. I'm so tired, Brandon. She could hear him processing it. She knew how he processed things. She'd lived with that processing for 2 years. The way he turned information over for weaknesses, for angles, for what it could give him. 5 minutes, he said. He believed it. She knew he believed it because his voice had changed, the hunter's particular relaxation when the thing it's been chasing stops running. She hung up. He's coming, she said. I know, Dominic said. He was in the hallway. I heard. She looked at the tablet. The 3 men from the roof were moving, descending, responding to something Brandon had communicated, folding back toward the front of the building. And there, on the east approach camera, the one Corelli hadn't known about, a car pulling up. Dark SUV, different from the ones she'd seen before. Brandon's personal vehicle. He brought his own team in from the car, she said. 2 more. Driver and 1 other. 5 total, Dominic said. Manageable. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that manageable with full resources in a prepared building and 8 operatives was a different word than manageable with Lim and a man who was bleeding through his shirt again. She could see the dark spread of it on his left side when the ambient light caught him right. She didn't say it. It wouldn't help. I'm going to the lobby, she said. You're not going anywhere near the lobby. You need him contained. The lobby does that. I'm the only thing that puts him in that lobby with certainty. She looked at Dominic across the dark hallway. You cover me. Lim covers the approach. I get him into the lobby, and I step back and you finish it. Harper, Dominic. She said it the way he said things, flat, absolute, a decision already made that was no longer open for discussion. I am not a person who hides while someone else handles her life. I have been hiding for 3 years. I am done with it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Stay behind the front desk, he said. The moment he's inside, you go behind it and you stay down. Whatever you hear, you stay down. Agreed. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. I agreed. He looked at her for another second. Then he turned toward the stairwell, and she followed, and the building held its breath around them as they moved down through the dark. The lobby was cold. The building's heating had died with the main power, and the November air was pushing through the structure's walls in the particular way of Boston in autumn, the damp chill that got into everything. Harper stood behind the front desk and looked at the glass front doors and watched the device in her pocket and breathed. Lim was invisible. She didn't know where he was, and she trusted that the not knowing was correct. If she couldn't locate him in the lobby, Brandon's people couldn't either. Dominic was at the elevator bank. She couldn't see him. She could feel him, which she decided not to think about in any depth. The tablet on the desk showed the east approach camera, the dark SUV, the car door opening. Brandon Reeves stepped out onto Commonwealth Avenue in a charcoal overcoat and looked up at the Whitmore with the expression of a man arriving somewhere he was owed, and even through the fisheye distortion of a security camera. Harper felt the old cold move through her. Not the new cold, the one that was tactical and useful, but the old one, the one that lived in the space between her shoulder blades and had lived there for 3 years. He walked to the front door with 2 men behind him. He pushed it open. He came inside. She stood up from behind the desk. She didn't plan to. Her body made the decision before her mind ratified it. Some part of her that had been running and hiding and pressing palms against locked doors for 3 years that needed, finally, to stand in the same room as the thing it had been running from and not flinch. Brandon saw her immediately. His face did the thing she remembered, the warmth, the terrible warmth. And he smiled, and it was the most frightening thing in the room. "There she is," he said. His 2 men fanned out behind him. She tracked them without looking directly at either. Peripheral, the way she'd taught herself to read rooms. The 3 from the roof were coming through the service entrance, she knew, where Lim was waiting. She held her ground behind the desk. "You look tired," Brandon said. He was moving toward her, slowly, the way he moved toward everything, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his adult life not gotten what he wanted. "I am tired," she said. Her voice held. She was proud of it. "You made this so much harder than it needed to be." He stopped 12 feet from the desk. His eyes moved over her face with the possessive attention she knew so well. "All of this, the running, the hiding, the new name, you knew it wasn't going to work." "I knew," she said. "I just needed it to work long enough." His brow shifted, slight. The first fracture in the warmth. "Long enough for what?" "For this," she said. She stepped back. Behind the desk, down. The way she'd agreed. The lobby exploded into motion. She heard it. She could not see it. She was behind the desk with her back against its solid back, and her knees drawn up, and the device in her hand, and what she heard was the controlled chaos of professionals moving in the dark, the sounds of impact and resistance, and the specific language of a fight in a contained space. She heard Brandon's voice once, a shout, startled, the voice of a man who had arrived for something simple and discovered it was not. And then more sounds, and then a crash, and then the lobby went very quiet. She stayed down. 20 seconds. 30. "Harper." Dominic's voice, close. She came up from behind the desk. The lobby was still. 2 of Brandon's men were on the floor in positions that told her they were not going to be a problem. The 3rd was against the wall with Lim's attention on him and the expression of someone who had made a very significant miscalculation about the evening. And Brandon Reeves was on his knees in the middle of the Whitmore lobby floor, his hands controlled behind him, with Dominic standing over him in a way that required no further clarification. Brandon was looking at her. Even now, on his knees, in the dark, in a lobby full of people who had been waiting for him, he was looking at her with the expression of a man who could not fully process that the variable had been her. "You did this," he said. Not accusing. Something worse. Baffled. Genuinely baffled. The incomprehension of a man whose model of her had been so complete and so wrong that its failure didn't compute. She stood in front of him. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. "You thought I was hiding from you," she said. Her voice was steady and quiet and completely cold. "I wasn't hiding anymore." He opened his mouth. Dominic's hand came down on his shoulder, and whatever Brandon Reeves was going to say died in his throat. And the lobby held its breath as the man who had chased her across 3 years and 2,000 miles looked up at someone who was, by every measure that actually mattered, so far beyond him it was almost a different category of human being entirely. "We're going to have a conversation," Dominic said, in the same quiet, absolute voice he used for everything. Brandon Reeves looked into Dominic Moretti's eyes in the dark lobby of the Whitmore, and for the first time in his adult life, Harper watched the thing she had never once seen on his face appear there cleanly and completely. He was afraid. The conversation happened in the basement, not the lobby. Dominic had looked at the lobby. The 2 men on the floor, the 3rd against the wall, the cold coming through the glass front doors, and made a decision Harper understood without being told. The lobby had windows. Windows meant exposure. What came next was not for windows. Brandon was walked to the basement utility corridor by Lim, who did this with the economical efficiency of someone who had performed similar tasks before and had no emotional relationship with the performing of them. Brandon walked. He didn't struggle. She watched him make the calculation in real time, the lobby, the men on the floor, the man behind him, and arrive at compliance not from submission, but from the same tactical intelligence that had made him effective at everything else in his life. He was waiting. He was patient. He believed there was still a move available to him. Harper followed. Dominic was beside her, and she could feel from the quality of his movement that the wound was worse than he was acknowledging. His left side was rigid, his breathing had a slight catch on the inhale that hadn't been there 2 hours ago, and she was cataloging all of it in the part of her brain that never stopped being a nurse, even when the rest of her was something else entirely. "You need to let me look at that," she said quietly. "After," he said. "Dominic, after," he said again. Not unkindly, with the absolute focus of a man who had one thing left to complete and was not going to be moved from it. She didn't push. She walked beside him into the basement. On. The utility corridor was lit by 2 emergency lights on battery backup, amber, industrial, the kind of light that made everyone look worse than they were. There was a concrete floor and exposed pipes overhead, and the smell of a building's infrastructure, the particular smell of systems that kept things running without anyone noticing them. Brandon stood in the middle of it, and in the amber light his charcoal overcoat looked wrong, too expensive for where he was standing, the costume of a man whose context had been stripped away. Dominic stood in front of him. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at Brandon Reeves the way he looked at most things, with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who was taking a full inventory before making any decision, and this looking lasted long enough that Brandon, who was good at waiting, broke first. "You know who I am," Brandon said. "Yes," Dominic said. "Then you know this is recoverable, for everyone." Brandon's voice was even. She'd give him that. Even kneeling on a concrete floor in a basement, the man's voice was controlled, the instrument of someone who had used it his entire life to persuade. "Whatever she's told you, whatever arrangement you think you have, I can make it worth your while to step away. Significantly worth your while." "She told me you'd start with money," Dominic said. Something shifted in Brandon's eyes. Small. Fast. "You've been running a private security operation out of a residential building," Brandon said, adjusting, the turn of a man moving through a playbook. "That's significant exposure for you. I have connections in the Boston DA's office, federal contacts. A man in your position would be concerned about that," Dominic said, "if it were accurate." He tilted his head very slightly. "It isn't." Brandon looked at him. Harper watched Brandon doing what Brandon always did, reading the room, finding the angle, sorting information into the categories of useful and not useful. She had watched him do this at dinner parties and boardrooms, and across their kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and she had once found it compelling, the sharpness of it, before she understood that the sharpness had no temperature and no conscience. "What do you want?" Brandon said. "I want you to understand something," Dominic said. "Not for my benefit. For yours." He crouched down in front of Brandon, which brought them to eye level, which was a deliberate act, and Brandon knew it was deliberate, and there was nothing he could do with that knowledge. "You built something around this woman, an architecture of control. You put considerable intelligence and patience and resource into it, and I recognize that because I recognize intelligent work." He paused. "And none of it was about her." Brandon's jaw tightened. "It was about the fact that she left," Dominic said. "That's the piece you couldn't manage. Not her. The leaving. The leaving said something about you that you couldn't allow to stand. You don't know anything about—" "I know everything about men like you," Dominic said. Quiet. Final. "I've spent my entire adult life knowing men like you. You are not the first person who has sat in front of me believing that money and connections and the willingness to go further than the other person could protect you from consequence." He stood back up. "They were always wrong." Brandon looked at him. Then his eyes moved to Harper, and she saw something happen in them. The warmth was gone, completely gone. The mask that had served him so well in so many rooms finally dropped, because there was no audience worth performing for, And what was underneath it was exactly what she'd always suspected and had spent 2 years trying not to see clearly. "You think he's going to save you," Brandon said to her. His voice had changed, stripped, flat, a voice she'd heard only a few times, late at night when he'd stopped performing entirely. "You think this is over?" "It is over," she said. "People like him don't do things for free." His eyes on her were clinical now, the assessment of a man who was losing and was determined to take something with him. "Whatever he's told you, whatever you think this is, you've traded one situation for another. You just can't see it yet." She stood with that for a moment. She let it land the way she let hard things land, fully and without deflection, because deflecting meant carrying it longer. "Maybe," she said, "that's my risk to take." "Harper." "You don't get to say my name," she said. Quiet. Cold. The coldness was not anger. It was something on the other side of anger, the place you arrived at, after anger had burned through everything it had to burn. "You don't get to say anything to me anymore. That's done." Brandon looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't look away and didn't blink and didn't feel the old cold in her shoulder blades, which was the thing she noticed most. Its absence, the space where it had lived for 3 years, empty now, just space. Dominic looked at Lim. That was all. Just the look. Lim moved to Brandon, and Brandon was on his feet, and the conversation was over. She didn't ask what happened next. She had thought, in the abstract, that she would need to know, that the not knowing would be a thing that lived in her, another weight in the collection of weights she carried. She stood in the basement corridor after Lim walked Brandon Reeves out of it, and she waited for the need to know to arrive. It didn't. What she felt instead was a tiredness so complete it was almost structural, the tiredness of a body and a mind that had been running a 3-year emergency and had just, in the space of one dark November night, been told they could stop. She didn't know what to do with stop. She wasn't sure her systems knew how to process it. Dominic came to stand beside her. He was holding his left side with his right hand, the unconscious pressure of someone managing pain they've decided isn't relevant yet. "Now," she said. "Now I look at it." He looked at her. Then he exhaled, a long, slow exhale, the first truly uncontrolled breath she'd heard from him, and nodded. They went back upstairs. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it. This struck her as strange, that a space could look the same after everything that had happened in and around it, that the couch and the kitchen table and the charcoal carpet were simply there, indifferent, the way spaces were always indifferent to the human weather that moved through them. She made him sit at the table. She got what she needed from the kit she'd brought from her apartment. Lim had retrieved it hours ago along with the rest of what she'd needed. And she worked in the kitchen light, which Dominic had restored with the secondary power system, and her hands did what her hands knew how to do. The wound had reopened along one edge, not catastrophically. The closures she'd placed 6 days ago had held for the most part, but the physical demands of the night had stressed the repair, and there was fresh bleeding that needed to be addressed. She cleaned it and worked on it, and he sat through all of it in the same way he'd sat through the first time, with the particular stillness of a man who had decided that pain was information rather than experience, to be noted and not responded to. "You tore 2 of the closures," she said. "I know. You were fighting with an open wound. It was manageable." She looked up at him. He looked back. His color was better than it had been in the lobby. The bleeding had been the main drain, and now that it was being addressed, his body was visibly recalibrating, the color returning to a face that had gone a shade she didn't like during the descent to the basement. "You need actual surgical care," she said. "I have you." "I'm not a surgeon." "You're the best available option," he said. "And you've done this twice now. The second time was better than the first." She almost said that this was a low bar. She kept working instead. When she was done and had the wound properly dressed and had taken his blood pressure with the cuff from the kit and established that he was stable, genuinely stable, and not just performing stability, she stripped her gloves and sat back in the chair across from him, and they were quiet for a while. The building around them was very still. It was past midnight. Whatever the city was doing beyond the windows, it was doing it at a remove. "Park," she said. Dominic's jaw moved. A small thing, barely visible, but she saw it. "He has a daughter," Dominic said. 8 years old. In Providence. She sat with that. I'm sorry. He didn't tell her not to apologize this time. He looked at the table and was quiet for a moment, and she understood that this was how grief moved through him. Not in expression, but in the particular quality of his silences when a silence meant something. What happens to his daughter? She said. She's taken care of, he said. That is not a question in my world. He said my world without effect, just information, the way he'd said most things to her. Factual, undefended, neither ashamed nor proud. She nodded. And Corelli? His eyes came up to hers. He gave Brandon your security layout, she said. He gave him the panic room location. Park is dead because of that information. Yes, Dominic said. What happens to Corelli? A pause. That's being managed. Dominic. It's being managed, he said again. Not tonight. These things have a process, but it will be managed. He held her gaze. He will not be a problem for anyone in this building. She believed him. She believed him the way she believed things that were structurally sound. Not because someone had told her they were, but because she'd seen the load-bearing elements and they held. And Brandon, she said. A longer pause. Brandon Reeves will surface again, Dominic said carefully. In approximately 6 to 8 weeks, in a location far from Boston. He will have documentation showing he voluntarily withdrew all legal filings pertaining to your welfare. He will have communicated to his attorney that he is relinquishing all interest in locating you and that any further attempts to do so were made in error. He paused again. He will be a man who has had a very significant change of perspective. She looked at him. And physically? Physically, Dominic said, he will be exactly well enough to make those communications. She sat with this. She sat with it fully, the way she'd sat with hard things all night, and she examined it from all the angles she had. What Brandon Reeves had done. What he'd done to the woman in Portland. What he'd been prepared to do tonight. The paper that called her mentally compromised. The spare key held between 2 fingers like a trophy. Okay, she said. Dominic looked at her. Okay, she said again, steadier. I understand. Priya called at 7:30 in the morning. Harper was sitting on Dominic's couch with a cup of coffee she'd made in his kitchen. He had good coffee, which she'd noticed and filed in the category of small, surprising things she was collecting about him. And the call came in and she looked at the name on the screen for a moment before she answered. I'm okay, she said immediately. A sound on the other end, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, the particular release of someone who has been holding their breath. Harper. I have been losing my mind. I didn't know if I should call the police. I didn't know if that would make it worse. I didn't know. It's okay, Harper said. It's over. Over how? What does that mean? What happened? She looked across the apartment. Dominic was at the kitchen table with his laptop, handling whatever the morning required of him. She'd watched him work for an hour already, the quiet efficiency of it, the phone calls in low voices, the things that needed to be managed after a night like this one. He glanced up at her briefly, and she held his gaze for a second and then looked back at the window. It means he's not coming back, Harper said. It means you're safe. It means I'm safe. The man who came to the hospital won't come back either. Priya was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, steadier, but with an edge to it that Harper recognized as the sound of a good person who has been carrying something they weren't built to carry. You should have told me, Priya said. You should have told someone. I know, Harper said. I could have. You couldn't have, Harper said, not unkindly. There was nothing to do that I hadn't already done, and telling you would have put you in exactly the position you ended up in anyway, just sooner. A long silence. Are you coming back to work? Harper looked at her coffee. She looked at the window and the Charles River at a distance and the November sky over Boston, gray and flat and indifferent in the way she'd once found oppressive and now found almost comforting in its honesty. Yes, she said. I think so. Same schedule? Maybe different. She paused. Priya, I'm going to be different about things, about people. She was working out how to say it as she said it, which was not how she usually communicated, but seemed appropriate for what she was trying to convey. I've been treating you like a risk factor for 3 years when you were just trying to be my friend. Silence. Yeah, Priya said. You really have. I know. It was kind of infuriating. I know that too. Another silence, and then the sound Harper had learned to associate with Priya deciding to accept something and move forward, which was one of the things she'd come to quietly admire about the woman over 6 months of arm's-length proximity. Dinner, Priya said. When you're ready. Not in the hospital cafeteria. Dinner, Harper agreed. Not in the cafeteria. She hung up and held the phone in her hands and looked at it for a moment and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the specific sensation of a door she'd closed and locked opening slightly. Not all the way, not with any foolish rush, but opening, the quality of light changing on the other side of it. She went back to 4C that afternoon. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it when she'd gone to her shift 4 days ago, or it looked that way, but she noticed small things. The closet had been disturbed and resettled. Her go-bag had been moved from behind the water heater and placed on the bed where it sat open, contents intact, a small piece of paper folded on top. She picked it up. Dominic's handwriting was what she'd have expected. Economical, no flourishes, completely legible. It said, "Everything from the building has been removed. The documentation you were using remains valid. I have arranged for a supplementary layer under the Cole name that will withstand anything Brandon might have previously commissioned. You are no longer invisible. You are protected. There is a difference." She read it twice. She sat on the edge of her bed with it in her hand. There is a difference. She thought about that. She'd built her life around invisibility because protection had felt like a fiction, the kind of thing people with resources and luck and people who loved them had access to, and she'd lost access to all of those at different points along the way. She'd stopped believing in protection as a real category of thing. She'd believed in concealment, in systems, in the infrastructure of her own survival. She thought about a man who had said no to 3 crime families in a single conversation. She thought about him crouching in front of Brandon Reeves in an amber-lit basement and saying, "You are not the first person who sat in front of me, believing they were protected from consequence." She thought about Park, who had a daughter in Providence. She sat with all of it, not filing it, not managing it, just sitting with it, the full weight of it, in a room with bare walls and 4 plates and a second-hand couch. She'd hauled up an elevator alone because she hadn't let herself call anyone for help. She put the note in her pocket. She walked to the wall between her apartment and 4D and put her palm flat against it. Then she picked up her phone and knocked. He opened the door looking better than the previous night and worse than the day they'd met. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his color was still slightly off, the body's ongoing work of repairing itself, making its presence known on the surface. I was in a gray shirt, no jacket, the first time she'd seen him without the armor of good clothes, and the scar on his jaw was more visible this way, the old damage plainer in the afternoon light. He looked at her. She held up the note. "There is a difference," she said. He nodded. "I want to understand what that means," she said, "in practical terms. What it costs. What it requires. What this is." He stepped back from the door. She came in. They sat at his kitchen table, the same table where she'd told him about Brandon, where Corelli had sat across from him, where the 2 men with laptops had worked. And the afternoon light came through the windows, and the city outside was ordinary. The city doing its ordinary city things, indifferent and continuous and very much alive. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said, "in order." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her, and what she saw in his face was the expression she'd been trying to read since the first week she'd moved in, the thing under the controlled surface. And now she could see it clearly, possibly because he was letting her, possibly because a night like the one they'd had stripped certain performances down to nothing. It was tiredness. Not physical. Something older than physical. The tiredness of a man who had been completely alone in his life and had decided a long time ago that this was the cost of what he was, and had made his peace with it, until recently. "My father made choices," he said, "when I was 11. The choices determined the world I grew up in. I could have left it. There were moments. I chose not to, for reasons that seemed correct at the time." He paused. "Some of them still seem correct. Some of them I've revised." "The brother," she said. "Marco," he said. The name had a quality to it, not raw but handled carefully, The way you handled something that had been broken and mended and would never be exactly the same as before. He's in Palermo. He left the life. I funded the leaving, and I have not spoken to him in 4 years because contact creates risk for him. A pause. He doesn't know about tonight. Does he know you're okay? A slight shift in his expression. He doesn't know what okay looks like for me. She sat with that. She thought about her own mother's silence, the unanswered calls, the changed number, the absence that was both her choice and Brandon's fault, and neither of those things fully explained it. She thought about how the people you loved became the most dangerous things in a dangerous life. "What are you?" she said. The question she'd asked twice before, and he'd answered twice with things that were true but not complete, and they both knew it. He was quiet for a moment. "I run operations," he said. "Financial, primarily, now. I did other things for a long time. I do fewer of those things than I did 10 years ago. The people I work with, the families, Corelli's network, I am affiliated by history and by mutual interest, but I am not subordinate." He said it carefully, factually, the deposition of a man who had decided the truth was the only useful currency left. "I have enforced things. I have been the consequence for people who believed there was no consequence coming. I have made decisions that cost lives, not last night, or not primarily last night, over the course of my career." He met her eyes. "I am not a good man by any categorical definition." "I didn't ask if you were a good man," she said. "No," he agreed. "You asked what I am." "Those are different questions." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "They are." She put her hands on the table. She looked at them. Her hands, the hands that had closed his wound twice, that had handled 1,000 crises, that had packed a go-bag and locked a door and pressed a palm against a wall in the middle of the night to feel for something wrong on the other side. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it without calculating what to do with it." He waited. "I spent 3 years making myself nothing," she said. "Not invisible, nothing. Because I thought the self was the liability. If there was less of me, there was less for Brandon to use." She paused. "I was good at it. I got very efficient at being less. New name, new city, 4 plates, no pictures on the walls." She looked at him. "I walked into your apartment because you were bleeding and I couldn't walk past it. And I've been thinking about that moment for 6 days, why I did it, because it was the first thing I'd done in 3 years that was fully myself, not strategic, not managed, just me, making a choice." His eyes on her were steady. He wasn't filling the silence, and she was grateful for it. "I don't know what this is," she said, "between us. I don't know what to call it or what it becomes. But I know that I'm not going back to 4 plates and bare walls and a life I was building to be as small as possible." She held his gaze. "And I know that whatever you are, whatever that list of things amounts to, you said she was under my protection, and you meant it, and you held it when it cost you something real." "It cost Park his life," Dominic said. Quiet. Even. Not an argument, not a deflection, just the fact of it, held between them, given its full weight. "Yes," she said. "It did." "I will carry that," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I watched you look at the table when you told me about his daughter. I know what that looks like." She paused. "I've been a trauma nurse for 6 years. I know what it looks like when someone carries things." He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light moved on the table between them, and she didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. And it was the longest they'd held each other's gaze without something urgent requiring it. And she found that the length of it didn't feel threatening the way it once had. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "Do what?" He gestured. A small, restrained gesture, barely a movement, but she'd learned to read the small things, between them, whatever this was. "Neither do I," she said. "I was engaged to a man for 2 years, and what I learned from it is what not to do." She paused. "But I know how to be honest. I know how to be useful. I know how to tell you when something is wrong instead of waiting until it's worse." She looked at her hands. "That's what I have." "That's more than most people bring," he said. She looked up. He wasn't saying it to comfort her. It was the same factual delivery he used for everything, and that was what she understood, its own kind of intimacy. The way he said true things the same way he said all things, without dressing them up. Your brother, she said. Does he know you're alive and well? A pause. He knows I'm alive. Could he know the rest? Dominic looked at the table. He looked back up. It would require... He stopped. The contact is complicated. I know, she said. But complicated and impossible aren't the same thing. You know that. You spent last night proving it. Something moved across his face. Not the ghost of a smile. Something more than that. Something that arrived more slowly and settled more completely. She didn't have a name for it yet. She thought she might, given time. I'll consider it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. 3 weeks later, she put something on the wall. It wasn't much. A photograph she'd had printed at a shop on Newbury Street. A thing she'd taken on her phone during one of her walks to the hospital, early morning, the Charles River catching the light in a way that had made her stop and look for a full minute before continuing. She'd meant to delete it and hadn't, and eventually she'd understood that not deleting it was its own kind of answer. She put it up with a single nail, in the kitchen where she'd see it every morning. She stood back and looked at it. The apartment still had secondhand furniture and too few plates and walls that were mostly bare, but the photograph was there, and the go-bag was not behind the water heater anymore. She'd moved it to the top shelf of the closet, still packed, because she was a person who didn't unlearn caution overnight and wasn't going to try. But it had moved. That felt like something. She was on a day shift now. She'd asked for the change and gotten it, and Priya had taken her to dinner at a small Italian place in the South End on her first Friday off, and they had talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with crisis management or trauma or the specific endurance required to build a life inside a threat. They talked about Priya's complicated relationship with her sister in Mumbai, and about the best street food in cities they'd both been to, and about a book Priya had read that she thought Harper would hate and was correct about. Harper had laughed at that, genuinely laughed, the kind that arrived without warning, and the sound of it in her own throat was strange and good. She had called her mother. That had been harder. Her mother had answered on the fourth ring with a voice that did the thing voices did when they were trying to sound normal over something significant, and they had talked for 40 minutes, and most of it had been careful and partial, and the kind of conversation that was really a first conversation again after a long silence, laying new groundwork, establishing that there was still something on both ends of the line. Her mother had not asked directly about what had happened, which was either perception or self-protection, and possibly both. Harper had not offered the full story. She'd said, I'm somewhere safe now, and I'm going to stay in touch, and her mother had said, okay, in a voice that meant a great deal more than the word. There would be more calls. She didn't know what they'd build toward, but the line was open, and that was the beginning of something. Dominic had written to Marco. He'd told her this on a Tuesday evening when she'd come to his apartment to check the wound. It was healing properly now, had been for a week, but she still came to check, and they both understood that the checking was no longer entirely about the wound. And he'd said it without preamble, just placed it in the conversation the way he placed most things. She'd looked at him. And? He replied, Dominic said. Took 4 days. What did he say? He was quiet for a moment. That he'd been waiting, he said. He said he'd been waiting for 4 years for me to do exactly this. She didn't say anything. She thought that there were things in a life that came around only if you let them, and that letting them required a particular kind of courage that was different from all the other kinds. Not the courage of dark hallways and direct confrontation, but the courage of opening something you'd closed because it hurt, and believing the opening was worth whatever came with it. Are you going to see him? She said. In the spring, Dominic said. Possibly. Possibly, she repeated. Likely, he said. She looked at the scar on his jaw. She thought about the 11-year-old who had grown up in a world shaped by his father's choices, and had made his own choices and was carrying them still, the way everyone carried everything, the weight distributed differently depending on the day. I'll come with you, she said. If you want. He looked at her. The thing in his face was the same thing she'd seen 3 weeks ago at the kitchen table, the one that arrived slowly and settled completely, and that she was starting to understand was the specific expression of a man who had not expected to be offered things. Palermo in the spring is... He stopped. What? It's very good, he said. The city is very good in the spring. She felt something loosen in her chest. A small thing, but it loosened cleanly, without the catch she'd been braced for. Then we'll go, she said. In the spring. Autumn. She thought about Brandon twice in those weeks. Not the old way, not the cold between the shoulder blades, not the reflex to check the lock again. She thought about him the way she thought about the things that had shaped her, fully, without romance, with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has processed enough of something to no longer need to protect herself from looking at it. He had believed she was nothing without him. He had built that belief into a structure she'd lived inside without fully seeing it, and when she'd finally seen it, she'd run, and running had taught her things about herself she would never have learned otherwise. She did not thank him for this. She did not perform forgiveness. She simply held it, the true shape of it, the real cost, the specific damages that would always be part of what she was. And she kept moving. Dominic had told her, a week after the night in the basement, that Brandon had signed the withdrawal of the power of attorney filing, that the physician's statement had been retracted, that the documentation trail pointing to Harper Cole's Boston address had been quietly corrupted beyond recovery, that Brandon Reeves had resurfaced, as promised, in a location very far from Massachusetts, and that he had done so with the particular quietness of a man who had been given a profound and vivid understanding of what the alternative looked like. She hadn't asked for details. She held the fact of it. He was gone, structurally gone, the machinery of her fear dismantled at its source. And she paid the price of not asking by not knowing, and this was a price she found she could pay. There were other prices. She paid them when they came due. The night she woke up at 2 a.m, with her heart running too fast and her hand reaching for the lamp, before her eyes were fully open. The moments at work when a patient's voice or posture triggered something she had to breathe through before she could do her job. The occasional reflex of checking the apartment door an extra time that she was learning to observe without judgment, neither forcing it to stop nor following it into the old spiral. She was not fixed. She did not expect to be fixed. She expected to be functional and honest and increasingly, slowly, more herself than the version of herself she'd been running. That seemed like enough. That seemed, in fact, like considerable work. And she gave herself credit for it in the quiet way she gave herself credit for things, privately, without fanfare. The first night they sat together on his couch, without a medical reason or a tactical briefing or a crisis requiring management, it was a Saturday in late November, and it had started because she'd knocked on his door to return a kitchen knife she'd borrowed, and he'd opened the door, and there was something playing on the television, a film, black and white, something Italian she didn't recognize, and he'd stepped back and she'd come in, and they'd watched it. He sat at one end of the couch, and she sat at the other, and the film ran its course, and at some point, she couldn't have said when, the distance between them had closed without either of them making a deliberate decision about it. The way these things happened when two people had stopped managing the space between themselves and started simply existing in it. At the end of the film, he didn't turn the television off immediately. He let the credits run. "You didn't understand any of it," he said. "I understood the basic shape," she said. "Woman leaves man. Man can't accept it. Someone pays a price." A pause. "That's the basic shape. I had personal experience with the subject matter." She paused. "The other man, in the film, what happens to him at the end?" "He accepts it," Dominic said. "Eventually, it costs him more than he expected." A pause. "That's the part most people miss. He thought acceptance would cost nothing. It cost him the most." She thought about this. She thought about what things cost and what they gave back, and whether the accounting ever really balanced or whether you just got to a point where you stopped needing it to. "Dominic," she said. "Yes. I'm not going to hide in this apartment forever." "I know," he said, "and I'm not—" She searched for the right words. "I'm not going to be something you protect. I'm going to be someone you know. Those are different things." He looked at her. The television had gone to a static menu screen, and in its light, his face was very clear, the scar and the dark eyes and the gray at his temples, and the specific quality of his attention on her that she had learned was not calculation and was not possession and was not the warmth that covered something cold. It was attention, just attention, full and direct and without a secondary purpose. "I know the difference," he said. "Good," she said. "I'm establishing it anyway." "I understand," he said. And then, because he was him, "The establishing is noted." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, the same kind she'd laughed at Priya's dinner table, the kind that arrived without warning. and she felt it in her whole chest, the room around them ordinary and warm, and not requiring anything from her except to be in it. He didn't laugh, but the thing happened on his face again, the one that settled slowly and completely, and she was close enough now to see it clearly, and she understood that she was the only person who had ever seen it from this distance. She let the film menu loop. Neither of them moved to change it. Outside, Boston did what Boston did in November. Wind off the harbor, the city lights on the water, the particular indifferent vitality of a place that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. And in an apartment on the 11th floor of the Whitmore on Commonwealth Avenue, two people who had built their lives around the management of danger sat together in an ordinary room, scarred in different ways by different things, carrying what they carried in the specific distribution of people who had survived instead of succumbed. Not fixed, not finished, not without the weight of everything that had come before, but no longer alone in the weight, which was its own kind of beginning. Not the loud kind, not the kind announced or celebrated or wrapped in the language of rescue. The quiet kind. The kind that started when you stopped managing the distance and let the space close, and realized that the thing on the other side of all that running was not the freedom you'd imagined, but something smaller and more real. Someone who knew your actual name. Someone who had seen the worst of what you were and what had been done to you, and had not used it, had not filed it under leverage or weakness, had simply held it the way people held things when they intended to stay. HarperCollins sat in a warm room in November and breathed without the cold between her shoulder blades. It was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was a life.